thank Pottery Northwest for putting this event on, but also having me on as a resident artist. It's really a amazingly supportive institution, and also it's just great to be a part of that community. So thanks to all that make that place up. As James mentioned, I spent a lot of the last 15 years working in glass, but I actually started in clay. My father's a ceramic artist, and spent a lot of time working in clay when I was in my teens and 20s. So I'll give you a little bit of background and talk about my clay and glass background, and then what I've been up to the last few years. Seeds, learning to look, and I put in learning to look, which will become important later, as opposed to learning to see. As I think about like looking as and observing as sort of like this broadly applicable term, whereas seeing is a little bit more subjective. So this is a picture of my family. This is my mom, dad, my sister, and that's me in the front there, and Beatrice Wood on the right. And I just could find any excuse to put this picture in. It's a beautiful picture, but also I think it's a little bit symbolic of my childhood, and that both my parents are creatives. My father's a ceramic artist. My mom has been involved in quilting, writing, drawing, poetry from when I was a young age, and I've always been surrounded by creative people. I sort of took that for granted at a young age, and always thought that it would be important for me to sort of take a different path, and I just sort of like took that as a given, and thought that I should sort of forge a different path. But anyway, I like to throw this picture in to give a little bit of a background. I grew up in a small rural town in Northern California, Ferndale, California, about 5 hours north of San Francisco. And it's a really beautiful rural dairy community, right up next to the Eel River. This is not too far from the house I grew up in. And I like talking a little bit about where I grew up because I spent a lot of time outside in my childhood, just looking and being in the environment. And I really learned a lot about being okay, sort of sitting and being relatively still for hours at a time, and just sort of watching what was unfolding in front of me. Which I think became important to the way that I approached making objects later in life. I also spent a lot of time fishing, which I think was the first activity that I really took like a sort of methodical approach to. As I mentioned, my dad's a ceramic artist. He studied at UC Davis in the 70s, and then got his master's at San Francisco State in the early 80s, and became involved in wood firing in around the mid 80s, probably when I was about 3 or 4 years old. So I had been around wood firings and then people who were making wood fired work from a pretty early age. And I'd always been drawn to the process. It was just such an exciting event. The communal aspect of it, the heat and the sort of performative aspect of it always was so exciting. And, I was maybe present at a firing maybe once or twice a year in the early years of my life, but it was always had a lasting impact. I was a little bit indifferent to actually like working with clay until I was in my teens, until I was in high school. But we did have a studio at the house I grew up in, and I would occasionally dip my hands in clay, but never took it very seriously until I was in my teens. This is the wood kiln at my dad's place, which I spent quite a bit of time helping him build. This is the front of the kiln, which is permanently bricked up, and here's the side where all the wares are loaded in. And then these benches, sort of my favorite element of this kiln, is these benches on the side that by the second day of the firing really heat up, and it's a great place to hang out during a wet, cold firing. As I mentioned, I got pretty involved in working with clay when I was in high school. Funnily enough, it was from taking a class at my high school, and that really pushed me to take advantage of the studio that I had at home. And then also my dad as a teacher, who is he's an excellent thrower and maker in general, and an excellent teacher. He was a high school teacher of ceramics for a number of years before he went back to graduate school. So I learned in more or less a sort of traditional way from him, where he'd give me a demo, and then I go and work on these little projects to give me, and he'd come back and sort of cut the pieces apart and check in and kind of give me tips on things to work on. When I graduated high school, I sort of thought that it would be important to, which I alluded to earlier, is like go in a different way, um, and go after a profession where I could make sort of a stable living, which, in retrospect was, short-sighted, but I think that that's just like, I felt like that's something I should do with my life. I listened to this interesting interview the other day that really resonated, and the artist had a pretty similar experience. He was really interested in photography and ended up going into his undergraduate degree declared as a business major because of what he called a misguided sense of practicality. And that really resonated with me. I think that was the same for me. I just felt like I wasn't attached to the major that I went to, but I thought it would be a great sort of like stable way to make money. So I ended up going to UC San Diego, declared math computer science. I ended up deciding I didn't like spending that much time in front of a computer coding, and had a little stint in the physics department, and then ended up graduating with a degree in interdisciplinary computing and arts and music, which was basically like a new media arts program. Which is kind of a topic for another lecture. But the important part of that experience was that I found glass while I was at UC San Diego, and spent the last year and a half heavily involved in glass making. They had a craft center on campus where there was a ceramic studio where I used to go make clay work to bring back for the firings of my dad's, and they had a glass shop, and I was initially just drawn to watching the glass blowing. It reminded me a lot of that wood firing process. So as I mentioned, I got heavily involved in glass making the last year and a half I was in school, and when we graduated, we had no plan. Like the world felt wide open. My partner and I had both grown up in different parts of California. We thought it'd be exciting to move out of state, and it seemed like a logical landing spot, Seattle, as it was a glass hub, and just seemed like a great place to be and become involved in the thriving glass communities here. Shortly after I arrived, I met the manager of Benjamin Moore Studio up at Pilchuck, and he hooked me up with an apprenticeship there. So this is Ben Moore on the right, Dan Daly in the middle, and Richard Royal on the left. So the first year I was in Seattle, I did an apprenticeship at the studio, and it was really an amazing experience. I got to work with people that I had already been aware of, like, heroes of mine. And they were just amazing artists coming in and out of that studio all the time. I got to learn how they approached making, but also just the sort of varied approaches to, making a life as an artist, which was a really, valuable lesson for me. And early on, I realized there's no sort of formula. Everybody that I was coming in contact had a different approach to sort of piecing it together, and they all seemed to make it work. And there was no sort of formula, so that really stuck with me. But anyway, I learned really a lot about working with the material at that studio. The first 5 or so years in Seattle, I just felt like I was, really soaking up as much technically as I could about the material. It's such a sort of physically and mentally demanding process that I felt like that's all I could really think about. I couldn't really think about making my own work that much when I started out. But this was probably the first piece and series of pieces where I felt like I was sort of finding my own voice in the material. This is made up of 2 parts blown in the hot shop, and then I work with them in a cold shop, cutting them and assembling them later. And I just really liked working in this different way where I was afforded this level of precision that I couldn't achieve in just the blowing process. In 2013, this is my close friend Brent Rogers. It's a local glass artist. We did a collaborative residency in Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh Glass Center. And we were there for a month initially, and ended up going back 2 more times in the span of the following year, to just make this collaborative body of experimental work that culminated in this show, Halfway to Somewhere. This is the show card from our initial show in Pittsburgh. And that was really an amazing experience for me. Maybe I felt like I had finally reached the point where I was, really ready to start attacking my own work. And and so we really focus on just finding new ways of working with the material. So this is the show card. This piece in the back, I think it's pretty representative of the body work we made. This is a blown object with a piece of sheet glass of a matching color that we would make from a cylinder of glass we'd open to a sheet. So we could, basically we went through all that trouble so we could make matching colors to the vessels. And then we would water jet cut these forms out of the faces of the sheet glass once it was opened into a sheet. And we were utilizing other materials like flocking, so that the opening on this piece is water jet cut. And then we used flocking on that interior opening, which killed all the reflection of the glass and just sort of made this, illusion that there was no opening there, it was actually like a painted on shape on the face. This is another piece we made for that show. This is a CNC routed MDF mirror, and then also flocking on those interior lips of the pieces. And this is some of the work that that I was making, my own personal work during that time, that I also included in the show. And it was, you know, following up on the previous piece I showed, where I was just using this approach to creating components in the hot shop and then mixing that with cold working and also with sheet glass. So this is, you know, some gray or bronze sheet glass TV shelving that I found at the Goodwill that I cut up to use for this piece. But I really started trying to track down materials, like really different flat materials I can incorporate into the work. And I just used this approach to sort of explore my interests in sort of in the history of objects, things that I had really been looking at and spending time with from when I was a child, you know, in the library of my dad, and then also, you know, in the history of ceramics and the history of glass. And so these pieces were just kind of like my exploration of that. When I started off in glass, I was really sort of turned off by its optic qualities, the shininess of it. And I think especially coming from ceramics and wood fire ceramics in particular, where everything's so matte and earthy and crusty. When I first came to glass, the shininess and the brightness of it was a little bit overwhelming. So when the first work that I made when I came to glass was all opaque powders and sandblasted, and it took me a while to sort of warm up to the idea of using this bright and shiny material. But at a certain point, I realized that you know, if I wasn't going to embrace the sort of inherent qualities of the material, I might as well be using another material. And so I really started to try to incorporate the unique characteristics of glass into the pieces that I was making. This is a wall hanging mirror. So it's like it's a little bit hard to tell from the image, but it's a cylinder that was blown in the hot shop, and then both ends were chopped off, and there's mirror mounted on the back, and then reeded glass, which you would see in like a bathroom or something, on the front with this form cut out of and then a gold leaf sort of rimming that opening. And these are probably the last blown pieces I made before going back to graduate school. And I was actually trying to, you know, I was thinking about the lava glazes and volcano glazes that are used in, you know, at various points in the history of ceramics. And I was really just sort of drawn to those textures and the colors, and thought that I could try to recreate something in glass. So these are the pieces that came out of this technique I developed for, you know, my attempt to recreate this in glass. And so the pieces are really simplified, just soft amorphous forms. I thought there was going to be enough going on with the color and the texture that these should be really simple forms, so just let that speak. So in the hot process, I would make these forms, and then I'd put these indentations that were basically placeholders. And then these pink, on this piece, pink rods were added when the piece was finished, when it was cold. And then the rods are actually backed with a piece of mirror. So that's why it appears to be sort of glowing, like any of the light that goes into that pink rod is actually reflected back out off the mirror that's on the back. So it gave this sort of nice luminous quality. And these are a few pieces from that series. And, you know, the color combinations that reacted totally different. This one ended up being a little bit more like an oil spot glaze and actually melted in pretty smooth. And I was using a lot of baking soda on the glass, and actually was doing this pretty interesting thing where it was actually sort of devitrifying and making the surface peel apart a little bit, which was kind of interesting. One other thing that was important throughout the time, and still is important to me, has been making goblets, making cups. And it wasn't so important as far as like the work that I was making. I wasn't pursuing this as like to sell these, but more as a way to understand the process of glass blowing and really make sense of working with the material and understanding form and proportion. And I felt like this process really forced me to be able to do that quickly and be more deliberate about my decisions when I was working with the material. As I mentioned before, working with glass, blown glass is it's more demanding than anything I had done previously. And so I felt like if I could get a handle on this process, that really any of the sort of ideas I was dreaming up in the material would feel attainable, because I felt like once I sort of understood a little bit how this worked, that I would be able to make the things that I wanted out of glass. And so, yeah, I really became sort of addicted to making cups whenever I could in my free time. I shared a studio for many years with an artist, Greg Clark, over in Ballard. And he ended up melting these light tints for his production work fairly regularly. And whenever he did, I would try to sneak in and make a little set of cups, just for our use or to share with friends. So I would say maybe 7 or 8 years after I moved to Seattle, I just realized that I had reached a point that sort of like this technical drive was no longer dominating my life, which it had for so many years. Just this drive to like understand the process and understand how to control the material. And then the work that I was making was really just, it was technical exploration, but also just a material exploration. It was kind of wrapping my head around the material characteristics of glass and working with that and incorporating other materials. And so I read this, when I read this quote, it just completely resonated with me, how all of a sudden I just had this feeling where I could sort of move around and sort of approach other things in the world again. So I'll read this really quickly. You gradually make a kind of rough compromise with the world, which allows you to float and flow. I mean, when I drive a car, I can attend to driving the car. And when I think about art, I can think about art in the sense that I've established it for myself, without letting art become a victim of the way I drive a car, or vice versa. For a while, that was hard. But once you're able to make that distinction, and once you've done it long enough, you're able to move in the world once again. So I reached this point where I sort of felt like I was able to move in the world again. And it, to me, that seemed like a logical time to sort of like readjust my path. And that's when I decided I was going to apply to graduate school. And I ended up going back to graduate school at the University of Washington. And so I would say there's kind of a distinct split, but like all the work that I was making before I went to school, a lot of it, like I was saying, was sort of like technical and material exploration. And I was very interested in kind of like fostering these connections between the hand and the mind, like the eye, and really, trying to create this like really tight loop where I was able to control kind of materials in a very specific way. And once I got to school, I switched gears, and it was, most of the work is really about visual perception, kind of how that system was working for me, but also people, just in general, and kind of things that we take for granted about the way we see the world. So this is one of the first pieces I made when I was at UW. It's a little bit difficult to get a sense of what you're looking at, but this is a large wooden, I was going to say pyramid, with these two rectangular frames on them. And what you're seeing is actually just, the color is actually from two sheets of float glass laminated together, back painted with white paint. And the image that you're seeing in those panels is just the reflection of the empty gallery space. And very faintly, you can see these interference patterns on the glass. I was a little bit disoriented, working in my own studio for a number of years and then going back to school. I felt a little bit like a fish out of water. And but anyway, this was one of the first pieces I made. This piece was really, it was kind of this elaborate pointer to kind of a light phenomena. I think it was just like being taken for granted. And I think, this was an important piece in that it just sort of set the tone. And for me being in school, I early on, I made a promise to myself that I wasn't going to rely on any of the work I'd done for the previous almost 10 years. And I was just going to force myself to work in a completely new direction. A number of these pieces that I'm going to talk about during my time at UW, I won't go too in depth with them just for time concerns, but if you have any specific questions about them, you can feel free to throw them out at the end. This is a piece I made for the Jacob Lawrence Gallery. One thing, a couple of threads that have remain important throughout the work that I made while at UW is site specificity and kind of a work, the ability for the work to respond to the site that it's being shown in, some sort of give and take between the piece and the site that was being shown. And then also contextual bias is this theme that I, return to throughout the work. So this is a piece I made for the Jacob Lawrence Gallery. This was the site that I decided that I really wanted to make a piece was for this bank of windows that was on the west, not in the west, it was sort of like northeast facing side of the gallery. And I really wanted to make this piece that sort of like seamlessly fit in with the existing architecture. I ended up landing on using the use of fabrics to sort of mediate the view that was going out of the window to explore the way that sort of pattern and color, like the way your experience of it changes depending on the distance you are from it. So this is, just the fabric, just the fabrics I use. This is an athletic mesh, and you can sort of see the colors underneath, colored tulle, this very open colored fabric that I was using underneath. And here is the finished piece, which is, in a lot of ways, was very subdued and subtle. It really just sort of fit into the existing architecture. And I think a lot of people that came through the space may not even noticed it was there. I mean, I think in a way that was the goal for the piece, but it was also, I was also like, it was a little bit of a contradiction. Like I wanted people to experience the piece, but I also wanted it to feel like it was just a part of the space. I wanted the piece really to be more felt than seen in a lot of ways. So the color difference you're seeing are actually just on density of fabrics. The piece on the left, I think it's all the same, all the same color fabric in the pieces, but there's just different layers. I think the box on the left had like 5 layers of the color fabric. In the middle, it was 9, and I think 13 or something on the right. And so this is a little before and after. It was very subtle, but in a lot of ways, it was sort of like one of the more ambitious things I took on. It was a lot of fussing with building that in so it looked seamless. And one interesting thing that came out of that was just that the images you could get by looking through this. This is an unaltered photo taken through one of those screens, and it ended up sort of acting like a analog or like a Luddite Photoshop filter. The optical sort of phenomena that was going on were pretty interesting with that piece. This piece was a piece I made for a group show that I was a part of at San Francisco State. We were able to visit the space a few months before we had the show, and I located this one spot in the gallery that I thought would be great to make a site-specific piece for. So this piece is it's a little bit difficult to tell in that image, but it's a wedge shape, a mirror-lined box, and the face of it is made up of borosilicate rods, and it's basically designed to capture all the light that's coming in from this bank of glass windows that are directly behind the photographer in this image. And it changes throughout the day. I really, I love this idea of a piece that could capture the ambient light in an environment and sort of reflect back this highly abstracted version of whatever the current conditions were. So it was pretty interesting. I literally finished this piece when I showed up for the show, took it out of the crate, finished it, and it was up, and I experienced it for a day, and then it went back in a crate. So unfortunately, I didn't get to spend a lot of time with this piece on the wall, but it was pretty interesting to watch it sort of change throughout the day. This is in artificial lighting after it got dark. My friend Andy standing in front, and you can see this sort of like heavily dispersed image of Andy being reflected back out. This is one of the pieces I had up for my thesis show. One, I became pretty interested in, and I still am interested in, optical illusions. And funnily enough, I mean, I'm actually not very interested in art. I'm partially just interested in kind of like what the implications are of what is happening during a specific optical illusion. So in this specific piece was using a brightness, perceived brightness illusion. It's called like a gradient illusion. So this is similar into the first piece that I showed from graduate school, where those two strips that are on that box on the wall are actually just mirror that are reflecting in the empty walls of the gallery space. But with that gradient background, you actually perceive like a reverse gradient on the mirror. It's quite subtle in the picture, but that's the idea. And then this thin little neon line was actually just to control the audience. Like you couldn't pass into the space, so you could actually never see your reflection in the reflection of those mirrors, which kind of was a recurring theme in a lot of the work that I did at school too. Was I had spent so much time making these three-dimensional sort of pedestal-based objects that this idea of hanging something on the wall and having this really frontal experience, controlling the viewer, that was like sort of interesting to me for a while, and I think still is in a lot of ways. This piece was called Field, which a number of you have seen this on the postcard that's in the studio at Pottery Northwest. There's a lot of actually similarities to some of the things I was exploring as what Rihanna was talking about. This piece was entitled Field, but it was really about sort of exploring, this history of objects that I had studied and sort of incorporated into my thinking and being. And how that's such a slippery sort of thing to quantify, like how things come in and out of your thinking and how they're affecting the work you're making. So I sort of picked through like this library of objects that have been important to me. And I decided I was just going to render them out of clay and not be at all precise about the, sort of like the proportion. I really wanted these things to feel like the way that I thought about them, if that makes sense. I was just, I would sort of isolate an object, be like, I'm going to sit down and make this. And I would make them fairly quickly. And I wanted them to be really kind of show up as the way that I think about these objects, rather than trying to recreate a replica of them. It's kind of similar to the way that Rihanna was talking about these pieces. So this was, this piece in total was supposed to like represent this field of influence. And it also, one of my favorite parts about this piece is I took the gallery door off and then made a scrim screen so that the gallery was actually open to the outside. So you get this sort of filtered natural light into the space, and the sound of the leaves and the birds outside. And I think that sort of hinted to the fact that I was thinking about how like a field of influence is permeable. It's always, things are kind of working their way in and out, and it's really hard to keep track of that process. Here's a little shot from, this is actually, I think, during my critique one of my professors took, but this just gives a good view of like the scrim that I had installed in the door. One thing another illusion that I sort of explored pretty in depth was this illusion called White's illusion, which is another perceived brightness illusion. And basically this is just the same shade of gray, and when it's on the white background, the background, it just appears to be a completely different color. So these are self-portraits of me on the gallery wall of the same tone of brown, that are just shifted onto the different background. So you have a completely different perceived shade of brown, which I think, with these optical illusions, I'm always thinking about like the implications of the way that we see things and how that is sort of like works its way out into the rest of the world. And so this piece, it was important to me, I think, because this piece wasn't important, but this was important kind of setting the ground stage for the piece that came after. Just thinking about the way that we see things in certain contexts and how that affects the content that we're seeing. So that led to this piece. This is a 1,300-pound rock that became part of this installation for my thesis work, using that same illusion and kind of talking about contextual bias, I guess, in the institution and institutions that we view art, and also in the academic institution. It was pretty nice. They were able to take the roof panels off of this space, so I was able to use just all natural light for the exhibition. After I graduated, I was asked to do an installation at Oregon State by the curator there with my friend Lucy Copper, who was in the painting department at UW. And this is some images of the installation that I ended up putting up down there. And this is last October. So, continuing with some of the themes I was exploring in school, contextual bias, this piece, I was using the pedestal as this form to sort of explore, think about the way that we see, look at artwork, and then also using some of these color, color theory that I've been using in school, like the context that you're seeing things on, how that affects the actual color that you're seeing. So I sort of became obsessed with this idea of using the pedestal because, when you think about hanging like a two-dimensional piece of art, you always hang it, 59 inches or 60 inches on center. But we tend to, when we're showing three-dimensional work, just use what's available, like pedestals that are available in the gallery. And it just got me thinking about kind of, things, averages, and the way that we just accept the certain things that are given in areas where we view work, and how that affects the way that we view those things. So these are a couple installation shots, and here's the other side of the gallery. This is Lucy working on the installation. She did a series of these inflatable Tyvek pieces for that show. And then the last couple things I have to show are from, since I've been at Pottery Northwest, this is the first piece I made at Pottery Northwest. This was field number 2, kind of thinking, continuation of this, thinking about like a field of influence. And I like this. This is, this distinct finite box, but it was lined with mirror and backlit with LED, so it kind of felt like an expansive space when you looked into this box. And I just really like that idea of kind of relating it to a mind where you're looking, you just don't know like kind of how far it goes, this expanse of influence, and it's always hard to quantify. So this is sort of just like a different approach to exploring that idea that I explored in the previous piece. So these are all like hand-built ceramic objects inside of these wooden boxes. Oops, sorry. And then a piece that I made for Nsika, a show that unfortunately didn't happen, but this was for the Echo show. So this piece was in response to the research that I sort of did about the life of Ruth Duckworth and her work. So I made a series, I think there were 13 of these small porcelain objects that were very just simple porcelain objects that I made these Kydex sheaths for. So Kydex is this thermoplastic material that is often used in the making of sheaths for weapons, for guns and knives. And this piece was just really, in a response to reading about how sort of a difficult life that Ruth Duckworth had, and how her work was so sort of like strong and quiet and sort of, antithesis of, her lived experience. And so this piece for me was about just how she in particular, but people in general, tend to use like creative outlets to combat, whatever terrible things that are happening in their lives. The last thing that I wanted to just briefly talk about was I've been getting heavily involved in photography for a little over the last year. And up to this point, I've really just been, sort of involving myself in the technical hurdles of making pictures. And I've just been going out and taking pictures of family and friends, but also just out around the city. But I feel like I finally reached this point where I'm ready to make a body of work incorporating photography. So I'm sort of planning this body of work where I'm going to be sort of picking some sites across the state to make some like ceramic and mixed media sculpture for, to like basically go shoot in the landscape. This is a picture from the comet that we had over the summer. I paddled across the lake when we were camping to take up at this place called Cooper Lake. It was just really a beautiful evening. And yeah, so I'm not really like attached to the images I've been making, but really sort of like mastering, you know, or learning about the techniques involved in taking these sort of images. But like I said, I've sort of been scheming up some projects to do with photography. And I've, you know, the last thing I've been getting into is film photography. And so I've been developing negatives in the basement and yeah, sort of working towards a couple of projects utilizing photography. And in particular, I've been getting into large format photography, which is kind of this whole other realm, but has been really interesting getting into just working with these like large scale 4x5 negatives and thinking about taking those like the site specific work and also like time sensitive work, and how I can use like the discipline of large format photography to fit in with the work that I'm sort of planning on making now. I think that's the last slide. Thanks, you guys.